Hello and welcome to a very merry season finale of Hearthbound, the boozy book club podcast adventure of three lifelong friends attempting to stumble their way through the pages of epic book series, all while celebrating each failed attempt to stay off the naughty list with a sugar-rimmed pint of their finest Christmas ale. My name is Matt Mullen and I'm accompanied by Lou Chapman and Sean March, the SD Kluger and Sam the Snowman, to my undying favoritism of Christmas claymation classics. In this episode, we give our final 2 cents on The Last Wish before we move on to our next book for Season 2. And if you're not following us on social media, you're going to have to wait till the end of the episode to find out which one it is. Such a Grinch move. We also wanted our devoted listeners and patrons to know that we're going to be taking a holiday hiatus from the podcast. 'Tis the season, but we look forward to keeping in touch with you on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at HearthboundPod until we pick it all back up in January. While we're at least 6 feet away this holiday season, give us suggestions on books we should read, Christmas ale we should drink, games we should play, or nerdy pastimes you just want us to know about. Speaking of patrons, we'd like to welcome a new patron around the hearth, Mike Klebow. To make up for forgetting to mention you in the last episode, I've prepared a very extra special epic shout out. So, I'm sure you've heard about Klebow's work in the Battle of Bluewick. Oh yes, the rumors, they're true. While the enemy was closing in and morale was as scarce as the hope in the eyes of the few men left standing, a singular beam of light struck the battlefield with great force, ceasing the persistent clashing of tired swords. The thunderous pounding of a sacred drum grew louder in the distance. There, suspended in a mystic light, was Klebow, the rhythm warlock supreme, striking fear in the once confident enemy with each tippity-tap of his musical artifact. A spell so unbelievably powerful, it was able to turn the tide for the resistance and bring peace back to the city. We're glad to have you, Mike. All right, enough of the humbug. Let's fill up a frosted glass, feed that flickering flame, and have ourselves the safest and the merriest holiday season. Because this is Hearthbound. Wow, that's so delayed.
So delayed.
So bad. All right, boys, what'd you think of The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski? We're still not going to get that right.
No, it's Sapkowski. Let's do one quick thing. 5 stars. 1 to 5 stars. Go.
5.
Dude, seriously, I have to agree.
4.
4 stars.
What?
All right, so let's give... Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to rewind. Why 4 stars?
So, don't get me wrong. Enjoyed it. Would probably read again. Not saying that. But in the grand scheme of short stories that I've read, other than the fact that they're probably like the first renditions of most of these first stories that I've read, because like I haven't gone back and like read like the old Hansel and Gretel shit. I don't like they were good, but for me the scale of the book did not match the length of the book or the scope of the book.
Can you expand on that? Because I'm not following. What do you specifically the scope or scale versus length?
So in the scope of a book that is like this one, The Witcher and his world, it is not.
There's no map, Sean. He doesn't like it because there's no map
like
in the cover.
That's okay. So 4.9 stars in that situation.
But like that's just like on the list of this whole bigger category of like this book could be twice as long and it still wouldn't fill the world enough for me to put it this way. If I haven't watched the show and know what I know about the video games, I'd have a harder time wanting to continue on this story. But because I know what happens in the show and because I know a little bit about the video games and I know a little bit about the overarching story, I'm already invested and I already want to get into it. But if I took that knowledge away, like if I was someone that just joined our podcast and I just heard about The Witcher for the first time, like I'd have a harder time wanting to continue on because this book didn't give me enough in one sitting, so to speak.
I see where you're coming from with that, and I think, and I can't speak for the author here, so I'm not trying to, but I think what you might be feeling is related to the fact that this was a collection of short stories. As I read, I don't know how true this is, but I read that this was a collection of short stories that the author had just thrown together, and it got published as a novel, basically. It's a collection of short stories about The Witcher that the author put together in this novel. And I think
so
that's
he
one of the
didn't
things...
write it this way. Is that what you're telling me?
Right. So this was entered into like a fantasy writing contest. And it did so well that he chose to continue this storyline and to build on all of this. So I'm sure that he had this storyline built in his head, and, you know, he had all of these different tangled storylines and these webs weaving together. But from what I read, that this was just kind of like he had this going in his head, and this was the very first attempt at it, and he threw it down. So compared to...
And if that's the case, then I completely understand it, but I still stand by my rating.
And I see where you're coming from, because you're comparing this, if I'm not mistaken, but you're comparing to this something like Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings,
yes. And I know this story, and that this story should be on par with those. And if I didn't know anything else about, like I've been saying, if I didn't know anything else about this story, like, you cannot relate this book to The Hobbit or a Game of Thrones.
Right.
Like, it is just so below that. But I know this story is so much better in the long run. So I wonder, like, if by the start of I think it's the third book is where it really becomes like a novel, like, right? It really becomes that world building kind of thing. So I wonder if we get through the second book and we get onto the third book, where I'll finally be like, this is my bread and butter. This is the epic that I was looking for.
Sure. It's hard to compare it because you're throwing it into the rings with heavyweights, right? Like you're throwing it in the ring with Tyson and Ali and Frazier, and you're going to get up against the big guys.
When you do have that kind of exposure, especially with like a series like Lord of the Rings, and I haven't, and this is hard to admit, but I haven't read all of the Lord of the Rings or all like The Hobbit. I've made it like halfway through, but I was just a boy when I started reading it, and it was like too much for me to understand. Like, I would read and then I'd forget what I read, and I didn't want that to be my experience. So it's kind of out of respect for the Lord of the Rings series that I stopped reading it, because I wanted to be at a place where I could actually read it and enjoy it. And I just wasn't as a kid. You know, I heard all about it, like the Lord of the Rings movies were out. I'm like, I just want to start at the beginning. And then I didn't understand what was going on. But when you have that type of world building where you feel like fully immersed, where in this story you are dropped into parts of the life, you can't really put it in the same category as them at all, because if you did, I understand your rating at like a 4, but because of what it is and the fact that for me it wasn't about as much of the world as it was about taking stabs at certain aspects of our understanding of our world through the eyes of this Witcher, this person who is clearly not in that time, but
kind of on the outside looking in.
Right. We are side by side with this guy throughout the entire book, throughout all of these notable journeys of his life. And whether or not the future books are written like that, like, I'm excited to find out. Like, where this book leaves me is excited for the ones to come, and primarily because of that whole, you know, these collection of short stories like the Canterbury Tales. It was such a cool story because you have all these people gathering and they're all telling independent stories that all somehow link together and take a jab at like what's wrong with society in real life. And then you have something like that with, you know, Grimm's fairy tales do the exact same thing. So what he was trying to accomplish here, we don't know for sure, because we don't know Andy, which is what I found out they call him, so they don't have to say Andres. But the way that he wrote this book in that short story, like these little tidbits of the Witcher's entire life, it throws you into the world. And I think you said that in one of the first episodes. It's like you're immediately introduced to what this guy goes through on a daily basis. Like, we don't have to understand all the the nations and all the elves and things. We know that they're there and we want to know more about them, but it's not important to the Witcher's journey. So for me, maybe it wouldn't be a perfect 5 out of 5, but it's definitely like a 4.7 because of just the way that it's constructed and the way that it really made us stop and think. Like, we've spent an hour an episode, sometimes going on tangents of purely morality of a situation that never existed. Mm-hmm. So it's like The Witcher isn't real, obviously, and all the things that he's doing isn't real, but the choices he has to make contrast to, like, you know, our decisions in a way, because there's monsters involved, but it's real life problems. Like,
his
real
choices
life morality.
are relatable.
I was going to say, because I know you want to move on to morality in that theme, but just before we leave, I wanted to agree with both of you there. Lou, I see what you're saying. You know, this is not on the same level as, you know, the epics. To me, this was on the same level of something like Chronicles of Narnia, which are a bunch of really, really, really well-written short stories, and the storytelling within them completely capture your imagination. But the reason, just like Matt, where I would still give it a very, very high rating, and for me it was a 5 out of 5, because I want to read this. I want to read what's next, A, and B, I want to recommend this book to people. So that's why I gave it a 5 out of 5, is because I'm looking forward to reading the next book. And then I've already recommended this to somebody who, you know, I told them we were doing this podcast in the book, and they're like, well, what do you think of the book? And I said, you should read it. And so for me, it's one of those things where this story and the storytelling involved here is worth your time, which to me is the 5 out of 5. I guess.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And maybe my past knowledge definitely, obviously, it taints my view of this book a little bit. So maybe if I came into this blind, I'd kind of be more okay with the fact that it was a little bit more short of bites. But I know that this story is better. Like, from the very, very limited knowledge as I know from the one season of the show and the little bit of the video game I've seen, I know this story is so much bigger than what this small opening has. And I guess I'm afraid that people, and that's the thing, it's not that I'm not recommending this book. I've recommended this book several times to people. So, listener, if you're keeping track of the books I've recommended, should be one of them. I just know that, and I'm afraid that, like, someone that came into this story, into this world, that is ready for the things I've at least talked them up into, like, it's up there with Lord of the Rings, it's up there with Game of Thrones. This first book is definitely not an indication of that. So, and for all writing reasons beside, you know, objectively, that's my rating. But let's move on to the next thing. And I think one of the biggest things that we all want to talk about, and if we want to move on to something else, we can. But I think the morality business questions of this book are huge and extremely relatable, even for a fictional world. And for me, the biggest one is this whole idea of what a monster is. And I'm kind of going to start off with another negative point, but I don't mean it to be that I don't like this book. But I think that question specifically is brought up several times. But I don't know if you get a clear answer, but I don't know if we can get a clear answer. But, like, I guess that issue doesn't come to a head. The Striga example is a great way to introduce it. I don't know if the Last Wish is a great way to end that discussion. Does that make sense?
No.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, yes. For me, especially, and it's kind of like an unfair advantage, and not saying that you guys aren't aware, but picking this apart, coming from like a teaching background with stories, I'm looking at different things than you are. So it's very eye-opening for me to see, like, your perspective on something based on your experiences, because that's really what it's all about. Is like what I've experienced with literature, my connection with it is going to come from a different place than yours. And that's the beauty of having, like, a thing like this that we can talk about, because I'm not going to think of everything just because I went to school for stories. The whole point of, like, a language arts class is kind of, we are not one mind. Like, everyone is their own individual mind, and they can read something, and depending on what mood, what experience they've been through, you're going to approach that text from a completely different perspective. And then when you put all those perspectives together, you have this huge, beautiful picture of what, you know, your book's supposed to be. And I think like if I was the author of this book, I would be stoked to listen to a conversation like this, because you're really getting not dissected, but just kind of ripped apart. But this whole idea of like what's a monster from the beginning for Geralt is you're introduced to him as if he is a monster himself. So, I'm thinking of movies where, like, can you imagine the perspective of like something like Halloween or Friday the 13th or Freddy Krueger if it was told from the perspective of that character, the monster? Because we're trained like, what is a monster? It's this scary beast that kills people, that tears them apart, ruins lives, families, whatever. But you never get their motives, what happened to them really until like later. It's just like, that's a monster. Dracula's a vampire monster. He just wants to suck people's blood. And he's like, hey, I just got to do this to live. This is what vampires do. This is natural. And I think he takes this idea of a monster and he just twists and turns it into all of these different questions. Like, and I think I brought it up in the very last episode of the last chapter of the book, is just humans. There's a piece of a monster in all of us, and it's kind of this very clear distinction. And I think of that troll example, like, no, don't slay the troll. We need him to, collect taxes for the city and to maintain the bridges and things like that. And at the end of the day, Geralt's opinion wasn't swayed, but us as the reader were like, well, wait a minute, if he's not killing anybody and he's just kind of, there's a trade-off for him, is that really a monster, or are trolls really monsters from that point forward? And there's this whole question of like the Kikimora. Geralt just went and killed that thing in the swamp because it's quote unquote a monster. It needs to be handled. But at the same time, like, would we go out and just shoot a bear because it's a beast? It's a monster, right? Like, just so we can, stuff it and whatever. So this has layers for days, but I think what it comes down to in the Last Wish chapter is the monster inside of all of us. And even though the djinn itself was a monster, we kind of still pulled some human emotion away from that thing. Like, it is a slave to its quote unquote master, and no wonder it's trying to kill Dandelion. It's trying to escape. It's confronting Geralt, like, make your last wish, you idiot, because it just wants to be free. It wants to be its own thing. And as soon as he does, it's gone, and there's no more problems after that. It's no longer a threat and a monster, but like Yennefer doing all these mental kind of things to Geralt almost makes her the monster of that chapter.
Yes.
So, it just sent me on a whirlwind of, especially meeting monsters like Nivellen, where he is on the surface, he looks like what a monster should look like, but inside, and he's even done some monstrous things as a human, but on the inside, there's a true inherent good. He wants to do well, and he means well, even though he's made mistakes. So, I think on this fact alone, the idea of what is a monster, like you said, Lou, there's no clear answer. There's just that nod to, like, there's a little piece of monster in everything, in everyone, but it's like the choices that you make that dictate whether that you are the monster or not. So
well said,
that's where I'm
well
at.
Said. I agree wholeheartedly with you, Matt, there. And Lou, I think that's one of the things that I really liked about the book is the fact that there was no clear answer, right? We just got these different glimpses of, the first chapter, we saw a monster become human, right? So we are introduced to this idea, this moral idea that change is possible. And then the second chapter, what was that? That was the first one's The Witcher, the second was The Grain of Truth. That was Nivellen, right? Where somebody who was human did something monstrous, turned into a monster, found love, and then turned back human. But found love with a monster. We had the lesser evil where Geralt catches feelings for a human who's doing monstrous things. And then question of price, kind of out of place. But the monster question there is, we find someone who falls in love with a monster and cures them of their monstrosity. Edge of the world is who are the monsters? The elves who are who got forced off the land and are simply trying to survive? The humans who force them off the land? Is it the devil who's helping the elves but is like, listen, this is just who I am? You know, there's all of these questions about monsters, and I think it ultimately, just like Matt said, it culminates not so much in the existence of you as a monster, but rather your actions as a being are define what your level of monstrosity will say.
So then, let me kind of push back and give you an example of, I think maybe how organizing the book would have made me would have made me happier. And this probably comes down to the fact that, like you said earlier, and I didn't know this, but it comes down to the fact that it was written as short stories and then put together as a book. But for example, like, to me, and I think we all said this, that chapter 3, the lesser evil, was like the epitome of this motif that we've talked about, right? That, you know, the actions of Renfrey and the actions of Strigobor are showcasing that, like, we are all monstrous, or we all have this part of monstrosity within us, and some things that we label are monsters, like the Kikimora, aren't really monstrous. They're just beasts that are trying to live their version of their life. So, long-winded way of me coming around to, do you think if that chapter, the lesser evil, was at the end of the book, it would have been the perfect nod or the perfect touch off to this idea?
That's a good point. Good question. 'Cause I definitely think it does. I think the book could have been arranged in a lot of different ways, and I think you still would have been left with this massive punch of a theme of, you know, or the what makes a monster question and how to answer it. And
here, not to cut you off, but here, let me rephrase it a better way. Which of these two chapters, A Lesser Evil or The Last Wish, showcases that monstrosity is defined more by actions rather than who you are? The Lesser Evil chapter or the Last Wish chapter?
Yeah, I think the Lesser Evil chapter kind of slapped a little harder in terms of I
well
did
said.
not just
this chapter just kind of bops. The other one slaps.
The point that I think I brought up with Geralt at the end of, after he literally just cuts down, he becomes the Butcher of Blaviken, and he slices all these people down, and then the looks in the eyes of all of the people in the town, even that Voice of Reason chapter leading up to that, of, you know, them nodding at him, getting that title and things like that, and him becoming that and watching it happen, and just him referencing that point where his first quote unquote monster he ever killed was a man who was trying to rape a young girl, and he's like, well, I'm going to make a man out of you. He rescues them. He saves her, but she looks at him like he is just as monstrous as that guy was. So that just sends, you know, Geralt into a, well, what the heck kind of situation. So I think that chapter would have been so good to end with at the end of the book. I just don't know, moving forward, like you said, in terms of the other books, how The Last Wish is going to fit into, because there must be a reason why the book is called The Last Wish, why that is the last punching chapter of the book, and how it leads into the next one. Obviously is, I hope that that's answered at some point, but I do agree with you. Like, if that chapter, The Lesser Evil, had been put at the end, I feel like the reader would have been left with like a definite feeling of like, oh, like, I don't know. Like, what is a monster?
I mean, like,
who's the monster?
All three of us, after the end of that chapter, were like, what is Geralt gonna do there? Like, how does we all acknowledge that he was put in an impossible decision, and that monsters put him there, regardless of the fact that they're human or not.
But right. You can't have that love story with Yennefer if the last chapter is Geralt killing the person that he loves, Renfrey, or has very strong, maybe not love, but, you know, has very strong feelings for.
That's a good point.
That's true. I do, Lou. I definitely see it. Like now, thinking about that, like I just think of Geralt. Even though he had the sign of like Ard up and he was blocking all the rocks being thrown at him, like just feeling the weight of those stones. Like no matter what decision he made, it was the wrong one. And they are just, every stone that hits his little bubble was a reminder of, you suck. Like you made the wrong choice. And he had to just live with that.
You suck.
Yeah. So, I mean, like if you could visually see me on video right now, like I'm just upset thinking about it.
He's
like,
actually sweating a little bit.
He is.
It's just that is a tough thing to answer. I do feel like the Jinn and the whole idea of the last wish kind of nodding to a love that may or may not be able to be fulfilled is kind of a cop-out way to end a love story type thing. You're building that relationship. I get it. But in terms of like this theme that we pulled from the book of What is a Monster, I think that ending it with the lesser evil would have been like a really, really good choice.
I think the reason why I liked that it ended on the story with Yennefer was because that was one part that I couldn't stop reading. So I started reading that chapter and I became completely engrossed. I mean, I read it all in one night and it was up to like 2 a.m. I couldn't put that chapter down. That, to me, in terms of storytelling in this book, was climactic. Maybe not in terms of the theme of this book, but in terms of what I was most engrossed in and what I wanted, what was a page turner for me. That did it for me. So
I'll take that. I'll take that as well. But
I don't know, Novellin, that chapter rocked.
That chapter was really good too.
So not to cut off the talk on theme, but what were our thoughts? Because I've watched the first season of Netflix now. Matt and Lou, you guys have as well. What were your thoughts on the differences between Netflix and the book?
At first, like the scenes that they do pull out of the book, especially the Butcher of Blaviken scene, I think was just a perfect way to boot off the show. Like that chapter, like we have just pointed out, the lesser evil is an amazing chapter, and it really, it introduces the reader to the true what is a monster, the whole moral point of the story. I do like how they try to replicate the book, where it kind of jumps around a little bit in terms of timeline, but we're also introduced to things that don't happen in the first book, like the whole Ciri timeline of how she, her origin story, essentially. Of you get that in the first book, but
spoiler alert here. Ciri is the law of surprise child that Geralt claims from Dunny and what's the
Princess Pavetta.
Pavetta. Ciri is that child, and some terrible thing befalls the nation that she lives in with Queen Calanthe. Yeah, and so she has to. The show indicates that she has to find Geralt, and Geralt is kind of like her destiny, and is the one to help protect her from the evil that is befalling them.
I guess it's very similar to like how I feel about like watching the Harry Potter movies, but reading the books. Like I'm on my first lap. I'm on the actually last lap of the Harry Potter series. So I'm reading the last book now. And I mean, just the emotions that are felt reading the book versus watching the movies. Like it's still sad in the movies, but just the way that it's described in the books hits you a lot harder. And there are certain scenes where you're just like, why on earth would you ever leave that out of a show? Like there are so many elements that would make this really good TV. And I kind of felt that in the Netflix series. Like Henry Cavill does an amazing Geralt. Like he is so good at playing that role, and all the commitment, the dedication that he has to it. Like at first I was like, oh man, Superman's going to be Geralt. I bet he's, never even read the books. Then I look into it and he's not only read all the books, he's played all the games. Like, he's obsessed with The Witcher, and he went out of his way to try to become him. And I was like, I changed my tune immediately. But it's different, and I know that it needs to be different. Like, as much as people want to see something verbatim ripped out of a book and put on a screen, like, if you know what's coming, it's not interesting, and people won't want to, they're going to lose interest. So I like the way that they've changed some things, but then on the other hand, I'm like, why the heck did you leave out Nivellen or Neneka? Like, these characters are amazing, and maybe they'll be in season 2, but it's like, that is a lot of backtracking if you have to introduce Neneka or even Nivellen,
Yeah, I see that, but like I'd push back on that a little bit. So just to like give my point of view, like I think the show does a really good job of telling a story in a very, very unique way. But I fear, like the first book, they may lose people that don't know at least a little bit of something, because if you don't truthfully, I did not know anything about The Witcher before I watched the show. It was after the show that I looked into videos on the game and stuff like that. But like, if you watch I've heard people tell me as examples that the first 2 episodes lost them in The Witcher because they literally had no idea what was going on, because everybody was all over the place. And I understand, as like a creator of someone that wants to tell an interesting story that's already been told, that you need to come up with creative ways to do that. And I think they did a very good job of coming up with a very creative way, but that really doesn't come into fruition until maybe like episode 5 or 6 of the first season is when it finally clicks in, where it's like, oh, this is all happening at different times. And like, I've talked to people that said, I didn't catch that until like episode 8 or 9 or 10 even, that all of these storylines are one big thing. Because
like Calanthe, you're like, wait, she died in the last episode.
Exactly.
Oh, like,
and like,
this is different.
And like,
that's a minimum of 5 hours of investment, and like at some point up to 10 hours of investment just to go along with this story.
Yeah, and exactly. And if some people are just like casual observers, just like, hey, I just need to have something on the TV while I'm folding laundry or something like that, and you didn't pick up that, oh, that Calanthe and that Calanthe are the same Calanthe, then you've completely missed it. And like, this is going to sound terrible. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely love my now wife, which is weird to say, but like, she didn't catch that. Like, if I didn't point it out to her, she was completely going to be lost until episode 8 or 9. And
I mean, I honestly had to look up on Reddit, somebody who is well-versed in the books took all the episodes and put them in chronological order.
And not even the episodes. I saw that. It wasn't the episodes. It was specific scenes in the episodes.
Yeah, they're like,
and put them
this
on
and this and this, and this is how this happens. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, it made perfect sense. And then after reading the book, I'm like, oh, I get it now. But it's like...
So to kind of wrap up here on Sean's question, it's like, the story did a great job of telling a story. The show did a great job of telling a story that has already been told before. There was a group of people that were going to watch this that already knew what was going to happen, or the majority of the key points, right? But they did it in a way that was still surprising to them. My only concern is that in doing so, they may have lost a good chunk of people that were just trying to get into a new story, right? Because they didn't have the wherewithal, the patience, or the attention span to get into 5, 6, 7 hours of commitment into a story before it finally all made sense. And that was like the people's biggest problem with Game of Thrones, right? Was that there's too many characters, there's too much going on, and that all happens in chronological order. Mm-hmm. Like, there isn't flashbacks in that much.
That's exactly all, like, that's exactly what I was going to bring up, Lou. Normally when you have a story, you expect some type of chronological order, right? So if it's going to go out of order, you expect some type of nod to you as the listener or the reader or the watcher or however you're consuming the story. Hey, just so you know, the timeline is messed up, right? Like the chronological order is something that a consumer of that story would take for granted. Mm-hmm. And now you can have multiple stories going in parallel, like with Game of Thrones, where you have, one story on this continent with this character, another story on another continent with another character, et cetera, and those things can all go in parallel. But the chronology there, it has to be, it was 1800, then it was 1801, then it was 1802. And if it's not like that, then you as a reader or a listener or a consumer need some type of hint, right? And I thought that the books did a good job of cluing you in, like, okay, I never felt like it was a hard for me reading the books to see these are out of place and this happens before another. Those clues are there.
And we get cued of that immediately, right? So like first voice of reason is happening, and then Striga encounter, and then voice of reason number 2 is directly after voice of reason number 1, which was directly after Striga encounter.
Right.
Like we realize that that's all that is the order of which it happened.
Right.
Well,
they made a
voice-
chronological connection there, and then they broke it. They make it and they break it, and you go, okay, I see what's happening.
Because it's that thread that's intertwined with all of the storylines holding it all together. And in the show, you don't really get that. It's you have just a bunch of things happening in different timelines that all do work towards the same story, but you don't get that till like the last episode that all of these things are connected to one story, because there's Geralt's journey happening in different timelines and Ciri's journey that is somewhat chronological order. So it's weird.
And then Yennefer's story, origin story, is in there as well.
Right, which just starts you back at a different time period as well. Yeah. So, I mean, in the book, you have that the voice of reason is very clear cut. This is directly after the last voice of reason, but we're about to talk about a different story. And I mean, even towards the end of the book where you have, Geralt and Dandy going like, remember when we went to the journey to the edge of the world? And then next page, edge of the world. This is the story that he was referring to. So it's
You're getting those cues. That is what the show's missing. To round out my point here, that's what the show is missing. It's missing those little subtle clues for even those that are paying attention early on in the show. Because, I mean, I probably, someone hopefully down the line here, Twitter, Reddit, whatever, points out to me in episode 2 where you can finally figure out, that these things are happening in different timelines. But for me, I think it really was the Calanthe episode, the Law of Surprise episode, that it finally clicked to me that like, oh, these storylines are all sorts of botched. I get it now. Yeah. And I'm not trying to rag on that kind of storytelling, because there is really good examples of that kind of storytelling. I cannot for the life of me, and I'm hoping post-production Matt can help me here, but there's a movie that's like a crime whodunit thriller, and you're trying to figure out who murdered someone. Huh?
Memento?
No, it's not Memento, because Memento is a whole different thing. Memento is just storytelling backwards. That's great too. But in this one, like, you're trying to figure out who killed somebody.
Clue.
But no, God damn it.
All right, sorry.
it was Colonel Mustard.
You're trying to figure out who killed somebody, but you realize that the climax of the movie, that the two paths that you're following are like 10 years apart. And then it all makes sense. And I'm trying to remember the name of the movie, but I can't. And hopefully post-production can fix this. But like that type of storytelling.
I don't know how I'm going to fix
this. We'll just interject with Lou saying it was blank.
Yes. That type of storytelling can be successful. So I don't want to shit on that, because it can be.
I think I agree with you very much here. And to go back to Game of Thrones, I think Game of Thrones broke a lot of molds in terms of what you could expect out of an audience, right? Because I don't think previously you could expect an audience to follow that complicated of a storyline with that many stories, with that many people over multiple continents.
Well, beyond that, I think is they broke the mold also in terms of like what your expectations were for character arcs. Like,
Sure,
you all your hopes and dreams for like Robb Stark, you're so invested in his character because he is the perfect example of like the traditional hero, where he is, despite all odds, winning, and he is making ground, and he's doing all these amazing things. And
you
then
should not spoil
Red Wedding. So the cliche that like he brings into the mix is that no character is safe. I guess that is the simplest way I can put it, is because you are predicting what storylines are meant to be, and then he completely just breaks that in half and throws in curveballs like, well, what if this person dies? then how are all these other characters going to respond to that event? So it's cool because you do get that this is happening over here, this is happening over here, but they're all reacting within that same timeline of this event just took place. What is the next move for everybody? And it moves forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great way, a great point there. And I think that's another mold that it broke, like, just like you said, right? Like, let's kill off main characters and people are still going to watch, right? So I guess my expectations for what constitutes good TV series or mini series or whatever we're calling have been recalibrated, because if Netflix, if the people making this show are going to, I guess, not baby me is a way to say it, right? They're not going to say, hey, we're going out of order. Then I expect them to really take their time and really get some of the finer details and the character arcs and the conversations. A lot, to me, in the story, the conversations felt very rushed. For example, the entire scene with what was his name, Stregobor, in the Netflix series, it just felt so rushed. It didn't feel natural. It felt very forced. And I thought to myself, like, you don't have to do in a movie when you have to fit everything within this 2-hour window. I get it. You have to force a few things to move the plot along. But with a series, when you're committing to a series, you can stretch out this character development and get these details right. And I guess that's where I don't want to say disappointed, because I wasn't disappointed, but that's the closest emotion I can have, is I was hoping for more out of the details and the little things that Game of Thrones did so well for the first 6 seasons.
Only 6 seasons?
Yeah, right. And I guess for what I was expecting for Netflix, for what could be for this series, I was a little disappointed in what I saw, but I also loved how it tied the stories together for me and made me so much more excited to read the second book.
That's good. That's
fair enough.
That's true.
I'll take that answer.
And I will throw the next, I guess, topic into the mix if you guys are down. But something else that we had talked about periodically through this whole journey through the first book was the idea of the Witcher's code, that this set of rules that he lives by, we never got a clear answer of what those rules were, because it seemed like they were ever changing. We knew that it was a code that made sense to him. I know Sean had brought that up, but what are your guys' final thoughts after everything that we have learned about Geralt, all the things that he has been through this book, including up to the very end, the last voice of reason, especially when he gets in this situation with the 2 guards where he has to literally beat the guy with his sword using the other sword. There's still these etiquette rules where it's like Geralt's rules versus everyone else's rules, and they're just never clearly defined because he does so many different things. So I get my question to you guys was what do you think this Witcher code loosely is? How does it work?
So to me, well, first let's clarify one thing. The Witcher code is only Geralt's code, right? Isn't that what we learned in the book?
But, well, not necessarily,
yes
because there was another Witcher or another claimed Witcher in the first chapter.
Yep.
Oh yeah, that's right. But Geralt did mention that he stands by his code, even though sometimes, or he stands behind his code, even though it doesn't really cover this section of whatever he's using it to not tell someone something, right? So just to clarify that, the Witcher code, Geralt's version of the Witcher code, to me seems like an excuse. And that sounds really bad. But it seems like Geralt uses it as an excuse to do good and bad things. So Geralt not killing someone that he can easily kill is an example of something that he puts in his code, right? This kid Talus, that he just made him hit himself with his own sword, even if the whole dwarf and the posse wasn't there to enforce these rules, something tells me Geralt would still not kill the kid. He'd probably, defeat him, render him unconscious, even maim him maybe, but would not kill him. Because he knows he's so much better at what he does than what this kid does. So, like, that's doing both a good and a bad thing, right? So, I don't know if that really answers the question, but to me, Geralt uses it as an excuse.
I think it definitely adds another layer to it, because I am contrasting end of book Geralt with our introduction to Geralt, which is that people literally say the exact same thing to him at the beginning of the story, that his kind, quote unquote, doesn't belong there. And he slices these guys down for way less. And this Talus guy and even Falwick, he threatens Falwick, but he doesn't act on that. And he makes it very clear that he can cut down. He's like, all your men right now are shaking in their boots. They don't want to mess with me. Including even the dwarf. He's like, listen, I'm not shaking in my boots. I'm going to do what I need to do, but I don't think I have to, because he relates to the Witcher. But all the other guys there are very uncomfortable by Geralt's presence. They know what he can do. They know his reputation as the Butcher of Blaviken and what he's capable of. So nobody wants to mess with this guy. But at the same time, we learn, some sentimental things about him and like what he's willing to do and not willing to do. And especially with the Last Wish, like, it was a very logical thing to let Yennefer die. She's messing with the djinn. Geralt could have just let that go, because in early book, Geralt would have done that. You're like, well, that's your fault. You've done that. But he has this like soft spot for Yennefer, which we all know, and she is throughout all the other books, so she couldn't die. But it's just like this idea of Nenneker telling him that something's wrong with him throughout the entire story, and we find out what that is in the very last chapter. I just didn't understand how all this stuff fit into any kind of code. So like the idea of calling it an excuse is really good, I guess, because he does kind of like, oh, my code, I can't really do that. But then at the same time, he's just like, well, I promised the king that I would kill the Striga if I had to, but I would try to turn her, so I'm going to hold that promise. So he was like very back and forth on all the action that he would take against beasts or monsters, depending on what it was. So I was just kind of confused. When it came to ladies, he was like, oh yeah, I'll do whatever. I won't kill it. I won't kill her. I'm going to do everything I can not to. But then like in some circumstances, he's like, okay, I'm gonna kill her, or she let him die.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Matt. I can't quite figure out what his code is, right? It's not a knight's code of chivalry, even though it sounded like at the very beginning he wanted it to be, and he had a very rude awakening that, like, okay, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So like there's no idea, or there's no indication that he's, super honest and forthright, and I'm just gonna approach every situation as honestly as possible. We frequently see him omit the truth or tweak something in his favor. But there's also this weird situation where, like you said, he'll just kill a Kikimora just for shiggles without anybody asking him to, and being like, anybody gonna pay me for this?
Yeah, right.
but then the other one is when the townsfolk are like, you can't kill the devil. If I was a Witcher, like, all right, that's not that's not going to be, especially after you got your butt handed to you. And maybe that was just like his pride thing. He got challenged by the devil who kicked his butt, and now he has to best it. But I would have walked away. Like, all right, I'm not going to waste my time, right? Like, let's just do this the easy way. I'll kill it, and you pay me, and we move on.
Yeah.
So I guess in a way he's kind of wily. He's adaptable, and his code is really, and I think that they nailed it in that chapter, with the same chapter with the devil and the elves, is survive. I'll do what I have to do to survive. I won't actively seek to be a terrible monster, but I have to survive, and I'm going to pursue survival as my code.
That's a really good way of putting it.
Need oats for Roach, right?
Yeah. Hey,
Oats
we're never
for
going to
Roach.
feed you, Roach. Yeah.
I know what our next sticker is going to be. Oats for Roach.
Oats for Roach.
Vote Roach.
Vote Roach. I like that one.
You know, like
too.
he didn't kill Nivellen, who could arguably be a monster, and maybe you could argue that there was no benefit in him killing Nivellen because nobody was paying
I
him
was just about to say that, or the fact that he relates to Nivellen.
But he doesn't seem like a sellout, right? It seems like he's willing to do what it takes to earn money, but it's not that money is his ultimate goal, right? It's he's not this sellout for cash. He's like, listen, man's got to eat. So
Yeah. I just, like, even from the beginning, I guess that initial chapter, even though it was super cool, it reminded me of The Mandalorian. I'm watching The Mandalorian right now, so it's, like, fresh. But the fact that, like, you're introduced to the Mandalorian's character as this, like, no bullshit, like, I'm going to walk into a bar, people know my reputation, and if somebody messes with me, I'm going to cut him down. But that is a very different Geralt than we get at the end of the book. He's just super
Lilac and gooseberries.
right. Like
she smells pretty,
so
and I like
weird.
pretty smells.
So it's like you have this very dynamic change in Geralt where he is this hard ass, but then, like, depending on the type of monster, he just kind of, like, alters his code. So it's this malleable thing that's constantly changing throughout the whole story. But then, like, other characters are just pointing out, like, hey, you're not yourself. Your normal brute self where you just don't care and I have to survive. So I don't know. For me, like, that's why I brought it up, because I don't know if this is something that's going to carry on into the other books, that we're going to see, you know, this cliffhanger at the end showing, like, his fate, if that's kind of humbled him out, if that's made him think about things a little bit differently than walk into the bar Geralt at the beginning of the story.
Right.
So
especially now that he's a daddy.
Daddy
A
Daddy
daddy of
Geralt.
destiny.
Daddy of Destiny. Daddy of Destiny's Child.
Destiny's dad.
Guys, we did it. Season 1's done. We
Season
finished
1
the
in the
book
books,
together.
y'all. What?
In the books.
Super
In the
Oh,
books.
hey,
Get
are
it?
we allowed to start
my
on
gosh,
the
I'm
second book
so
of the Witcher
punny.
series?
No.
What?
I say no.
We gotta space that sucker out.
But I want to read it.
We got.
You just gotta wait.
I suggest you.
Dude,
let that
I have
one
I have a better book for you to read. I will suggest a better book.
Okay.
better.
For our nonfiction fans, I'm currently reading Homo Deus, which is a very,
Oh, yeah. Did you read
very
Homo
good
Sapiens?
book. Not yet.
Oh, read Homo Sapiens. It's good.
All right. But anyway, thanks for listening to Hearthbound. We'll catch you in the next one.
I would say this is Hearthbound, but then Matt would have to say, no, this is Patrick. So.
Tune in next time for season 2 of Hearthbound.
Later, guys.
You know, I still can't figure out which movie Lou was talking about. Pulp Fiction? Maybe it was Westworld. I guess we'll never know. Okay, so if you're bummed about us moving on from the Witcher series, don't worry. We're not done with Geralt of Rivia just yet. We're just really greedy when it comes to reading new and awesome books. Speaking of which, as promised, the good people of Twitter have spoken, and we will be reading Dune for Season 2. So if you haven't already done so, you should totally add it to your wish list so you can read it along with us in January. On a totally separate note, I wanted to congratulate at D3CarrieB, aka the Odin King on Twitter, for being the winner of our Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Game of the Year Edition giveaway. It is such a good game, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we do. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode of Hearthbound. If you had a holly jolly good time, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcasting app. As mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you can follow our holiday shenanigans on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at HearthboundPod. If you're looking to get an epic shout out like the one you heard at the beginning of the episode, want to join our exclusive sticker club, or just want to support the podcast in general, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/HearthboundPodcast. We appreciate everyone who made Hearthbound possible this year, and with that being said, here's a toast to you, the listener. Here's to good reads, tasty beer, and unparalleled friendship. Cheers, and see you in the next season of Hearthbound.